Well, hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to try to do something I've been talking about doing all year long since 2020 started, because I started talking about it because I got a shipment of books from my father, 3 boxes that had been in his house waiting to be sent to me, and he finally sent them to me. And I had wanted to do a bookshelf tour once I was done unboxing those so I could figure out how to fit everything in. The process of fitting everything in got really difficult, so I kind of pushed it off, and then quarantine hit and really threw everything off. But so part of the struggle was that these were the only 3 bookcases that I had. What we ended up doing was adding a 4th bookshelf, which is what my phone is propped up on right now. And this is kind of my library. So, but then quarantine hit, and my husband has been working from home. My foster son has been working from home. He finally graduated. It just threw a lot of things into chaos. My boss, actually, he is traditionally on the West Coast. He's been on the East Coast, which means I usually film in the mornings and before I start my workday, but he's already working in the morning, so it just chaos. Now, I haven't really thought about how I want to do this. I've seen a lot of different varieties of bookshelf tour, and I think the ones that I like the most are the ones where you're not just showing a book, every single book that's on your shelf. You're kind of talking a little bit, and I tend to like to be a little spontaneous. So I think what I'm going to do is go through, talk about some of the books a little bit as the mood strikes me, and maybe only mention a couple of things that don't really merit a whole lot of other discussion. And we'll see how that goes. I haven't really thought too much because I want to try out a different format. I'm thinking for timing purposes, I don't want this video to get really long. I'm probably going to do installments, go through and see how long it takes for me to get through all of my shelves, and we'll see how that goes. But I'm thinking for timing purposes, I'm really only planning on doing the first 2, which would take me into the B's, but not finish the B's. And we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to cut it, I'm probably going to edit a piece out in a second and just grab a handful and talk about them that way, so that way I'm not fighting with the bookshelf while I'm filming, because that sounds like a terrible thing for you to have to watch. Okay, there you go. I have emptied out the first shelf. I enlisted the help of a chair and piled them right here so I can start going through them. First, let's talk about Kobo Abe. He is the first 3 books on my shelf. And basically, I read The Woman in the Dunes about 10 years ago when I was on vacation in the Caribbean. Someone had recommended it to me, and I really loved this book. I would count it as one of my favorites. So I wanted to read more by him, and I went out and purchased The Boxman and The Arc Sakura. I have not gotten around to reading either one of them, but I really hope to someday. Next, we have 2 books by Andre Osman. The first is Call Me By Your Name, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It was recommended to me by my husband, and its sequel, Find Me, which I have not read, and which is, so if you know my TBR pattern, what I do is a book that I want on my TBR, I just pull out a little more than the others, and this is pulled out, but I'm gonna not do that anymore because the feedback on the book has not been great, so I'm not prioritizing it anymore. I would like to get to it someday and decide for myself, but it's not going to have that priority anymore. The next 3 books are My Father and Myself by J.R. Ackerley, which I just finished, Harbor by Lorraine Adams, which I read when it was first published and released in paperback and probably should revisit at some point, and Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which I have talked about a lot. Next, we have 2 books by Aravinda Diga. The first one is Last Man in Tower, which I have not gotten around to reading, and The White Tiger, which I believe went on to win the Booker Prize. I have an advanced reader's copy of it that I got when I was still working at Borders. I haven't gotten around to reading it, but I've heard really good things about both of them. Then there's Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda. Haven't gotten around to that. And Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, which I finally read for the first time at the end of last year, beginning of this year. Now we have The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. This is something I'm trying to prioritize for this year. I want to get to it because part of my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge is to read books from authors outside of North America and Europe, and I need to cover South America. So The House of the Spirits seems like a good way to do that. And Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. I got this because it was for sale at my library for like $1. So I grabbed it, but I have no idea if and when I will ever get around to reading it because I hear it's just a hard book to get through in terms of subject matter. Next, we have a book that was recommended to me by someone I used to work with whose opinion on books I really respect. It's Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis. The bookseller in question said that this was one of her favorite books of all time, and I deeply respect her opinion. I just haven't gotten around to reading it yet. Now we have a book by Richard Amory called Song of the Loon. This is one of the Little Sisters classics, forgotten LGBT classics that have been brought back. Looking forward to reading that at some point. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, which I have also not read, which seems appalling, and I need to fix that. Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin, haven't gotten around to that either. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, that one I have read, so there you go. And Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, which I also need to get around to reading at some point. Next we have 2 books by Jane Austen. The first one is Emma, which I have not read. People pointed out to me that Jane Austen July is a perfect time to do it, so I might try to get to Emma this month. After having a strict TBR in June, I don't really want to have one in July, so we'll see if I get to it or not. And then I bought myself a copy of Pride and Prejudice just because I love that book. Then we have The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree by Shikufe Azar. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. And If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. Of his books, I have read Giovanni's Room and If Beale Street Could Talk. I really want to get to The Fire Next Time and Go Tell It on the Mountain. Then we have J.G. Ballard's Crash, which I had been thinking about unhauling when I was going through everything in January and trying to decide what to do and what to keep and what to get rid of. But a couple of people pointed out that J.G. Ballard is an author I should try at some point. So we'll see if and when I ever get around to it. Then we have Affliction by Russell Banks, which an old GM at a Borders that I worked at told me was a fantastic book, and he had recommended a couple of things to me, and I never got around to the others because the first one he recommended to me and I read ended up being a very sexual book, and that was odd. So although I'm interested in a lot of the other books he recommended to me, that kind of was interesting, let's just say that. And then there is The Books of Blood, volumes 1 through 3 by Clive Barker. Clive Barker was recommended to me as, and I actually enjoyed some of the stories that I've read, but I have not read all of this. I have read a good chunk of it, though. And then there is The Hellbound Heart, which I think is actually in The Books of Blood, and this is what the movie Hellraiser was based on. I have read it. Finishing off shelf number 1, we have the trilogy of books by Pat Barker, Regeneration. I have read Regeneration roughly 11 years ago now. Where I read it for a class when I was in college and really loved it, have wanted to read the rest of the books in the series, but it's taken me so long to get to them that I feel like I should reread Regeneration when I eventually do. The others are The Eye in the Door and The Ghost Road, which won a Booker Prize. And then the final book on that shelf is You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr. Okay, I've emptied out shelf number 2. Let's get going on that. First one, Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry. This was a finalist for the Booker Prize last year, I believe. Haven't gotten around to reading it yet. Jennifer Government by Max Barry. I read this when it first came out in paperback. I remember really liking it. It's kind of a sci-fi satire, and I would recommend it. Then we have The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bauby. I have the movie tie-in of it, which I don't usually get, but I read it because of the movie, and it was all that was available, and it was a really good book. The Sellout by Paul Beatty. This is a book that I can't believe I haven't managed to get to yet because I really, really, really want to read it. Wish Her Safe at Home by Stephen Benatar. This is a book that was recommended to me by Sean the Book Maniac, and I have not gotten around to reading, but I'm really looking forward to. Then we have Are You My Mother by Alison Bechdel. This is the sequel to Fun Home, which will be next on the list. I didn't like it as much as Fun Home, and I loved Fun Home, though. This is such a good book. Such a good book. Oh, my God. Next, we have City of Thieves by David Benioff. I've heard really good things about it, but haven't read it yet. The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett just came out. Have not gotten around to reading it yet. A Manual for Cleaning Women. These are short stories by Lucia Berlin. Fantastic collection. If you have not read this, get on it right now. I love it. Mary Berry's autobiography, Recipe for Life. I adore Mary Berry, so don't judge me. I have read that one. Lie With Me by Philippe Besson. I read this last year. It's translated from French by Molly Ringwald, interestingly. The Best American Short Stories 2012, edited by Tom Perrotta. The Best American Short Stories of the Century by John Updike. Obviously, this is 1900 through 1999. I think I've read a couple of them, but I have not read the whole thing. The Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce. I was fascinated with this when I was in high school. And then there is Down and Dirty Pictures, Miramax, Sundance, and the Rise of Independent Film by Peter Biskind. This is a book that was recommended in a podcast that I listen to about movies. If you follow along at all, you know that I am very interested in the Oscars. And you can't really talk about the Oscars in the last 20, 25 years without talking about Miramax, as uncomfortable as that is. And this book is supposed to be a very comprehensive history about it. I have not gotten around to it yet, but I want to. And speaking of Oscars, you may notice I have a generic knockoff one here that is for Best Husband. So in case you're wondering, it's me. I am the best husband, according to my husband, of course. But moving along, then there's The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Have not read this yet. 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. It came out in a couple of different editions when it was first released, and I got this one because I liked the different paperbacks in it. I believe I started it. I think I may have read the first book and then got interrupted and didn't finish it, and I've always been meaning to get back to it. Then there is Ruby by Cynthia Bond, which I have read. Drop City by T.C. Boyle, have not read. Tortilla Curtain by T.C. Boyle, have not read that one either. And The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne, read it, loved it. Unfortunately, the only other book of John Boyne's that I have read, I did not like at all. So much so that I actually unhauled it. That was A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. Moving along, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I read an excerpt of this in junior high, have always been meaning to read the rest of it, and have never gotten around to it. Then we have three books or novellas by Richard Brautigan: Revenge of the Lawn, The Abortion, and So the Wind Won't Blow It All Away. This is another book that was recommended to me by that GM at Borders. He said Richard Brautigan was an essential author to discover. I've never gotten around to reading it. Then there's a book called A Time to Live, which has nudity on the cover that I will cover up. This popped up in recommendations for me based on other books that I've read, and it's a queer book from the 90s, so I felt, okay, cool, you caught my interest. Then we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I have never read it. I've never read anything by any of the Brontes, which seems appalling. Then there is Karamo by Karamo Brown. I did read this in June, and I enjoyed it. Finishing up the items on shelf number 2, we have The Gifts of the Body by Rebecca Brown. This was one of my favorite reads from last year. It is still in print, but you have to order it. I would recommend it very much. Please discover that book. And then there's Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown, which was on sale at my library. I have not gotten around to reading it, but I really want to. And then there's Intoxicated by My Illness by Anatole Breillat. I have read 2 books by Anatole Breillat. This one, and is it on my shelf? Apparently I don't have the other one, which was Kafka Was the Rage, a Greenwich Village memoir. And that one actually does not have an ending because he was diagnosed with a terminal cancer and ended up not finishing it to write this before he died. It's a painful book to read, but it's very smart and a very good book. Okay, we're not doing too badly on time, so I'm just going to quickly check my work email and then we can keep going. Okay, diving into shelf number 3, we have Till the Wolves I'm Home by Carol Rivka Brunt. A lot of people have recommended this book to me since I read it. It was on the staff picks at Northshire Bookstore, which is my favorite bookstore. I read it, and I found it deeply uncomfortable. There's a relationship at the center of this book that I thought was just kind of creepy, to be honest. Then we have my fancy edition of The Good Earth, which I have talked about a lot, by Pearl S. Buck. The Best We Could Do by T. Bui. Really enjoyed this book last year. If you haven't read it, I recommend checking it out. We Need New Names by Novilet Buluwayo. Very good book. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This is obviously translated from the Russian. Very much recommend this book if you have not read it. Then we have His Bloody Project by Graham McRae Burnett, which I have not gotten around to reading but would really like to. The Gallery by John Horn Burns, which I have not read but would like to. You're hearing that a lot. A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain by Robert Olin Butler. This is a collection of short stories that won the Pulitzer Prize. I read it, 15, 20 years ago and remember really liking it, but I'm thinking I'm going to reread it for my Pulitzer Prize project when I get around to it. And then there is The Great Pretender by Susanna Cahalan, which I have not read yet. Then we have The Night Season by Chelsea Kane, which I got because I like to have mystery thrillers on hand for when I'm in a mood for something like that. And just so you get whiplash, we're going to go from that to The Stranger by Albert Camus, which I have not read. And then The Alienist by Caleb Carr, which I also have not read. Angela Carter's collection of stories, The Bloody Chamber, which had been recommended, and then when I saw it in a store and saw the art, so the art for this Penguin edition was done by a tattoo artist, and it's just beautiful. So I felt like it had been recommended and I wanted to read it, and so I got that edition of it. And I remember enjoying it, but I actually don't remember pretty much any of the stories that are in it. Next is Where I'm Calling From, stories by Raymond Carver. I remember absolutely loving this book, but I should probably reread it at some point. It is one of my favorites, but I feel like I might need to revisit it, and we'll leave it at that for now. Leading Men by Christopher Castellani, which I read half of before bailing because I was disappointed in it. Then there's Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. I have not read this one yet. The only one of hers that I have read is My Antonia which I really enjoyed. So I'm looking forward to reading more by her. In fact, here is My Antonia. And then we have The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. I have read this one. I loved it. And then we have Wonder Boys by Michael Chabon. Again, I don't like movie tie-ins, but I bought it when the movie came out. So this is the version that I have. And now if I ever do pick it up, I'm going to have Michael Douglas staring at me. I would like to read it at some point. Moving along, we have The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This is not the version of it that I read, but I have read this book. I was given this book when I graduated from high school. And it was kind of like a chain letter. People were writing inscriptions in it and then passing it on to somebody else who they thought could benefit from it. So I read it, wrote a quick little note to a friend, passed it on to her, and I hope that the book is still going. But I loved the book at the time, so I bought myself a copy of it, and maybe should reread it at some point, because I think it was perfect at that time, but I don't know if I would love it as much if I read it now. And then it took a really long time for him to write another book. And when he did, it was a chunkster imaginary friend. I have not gotten around to reading this yet. Then we have Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. It's the only Agatha Christie book that I own, although I have read a lot, and I didn't like it. Don't at me. Next, we have two books by Susanna Clarke. The Ladies of Grace Adieu, which is a collection of short stories that I really loved, all set within the world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a book that I love, but is really long and probably longer than it needs to be. However, I just really enjoyed the book. I love how in-depth it is. I love the fact that it has footnotes. I love the world building that it does. So it's probably longer than it needs to be, but I liked it. And finishing up shelf number 3, we have The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I have not gotten around to reading yet. Okay, originally, that is where this video ended, but I started editing, and I had been concerned that it was running long because it was approaching 30 minutes. However, most of that time turns out was spent getting things on and off of the bookshelves. So it ended up getting cut way back. So I figured, why not come back and we'll finish this bookshelf. So let's keep going. The next book is The Land of Stories by Chris Colfer. This is the first book from shelf number 4, which you can't really see because it's over there. I actually managed to get a copy of this at Book Expo when I was still working in publishing, and I got it signed by Chris Colfer. At the time, I was a huge Glee fanatic, and he listened to me very patiently talk about how my husband and I loved the show. So that's pretty cool. Next is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I was really obsessed with these Penguin Great Books of the 20th Century editions at the time that they were released. They don't exist anymore. They're not in print. And of course, it was only books that Penguin had access to. So, you know, they couldn't just pick any book. So it was a little bit biased in that regard, but I really picked up a lot of them, and I have not gotten around. I did read The Land of Stories, but I have not read Heart of Darkness yet, at least. Then there's The Great Santini by Pat Conroy. I kind of love these old-fashioned covers. I have never read a book by Pat Conroy, and this is one that has been recommended to me, so I would like to get around to it at some point. Then there's Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid Rojas Contreras. I have heard very good things about this book from people here on BookTube and would like to get around to it, but I have not read it yet. Next is Tim Conway's What's So Funny. This is actually from the same Book Expo where I got The Land of Stories. I managed to snag a copy of this. Unfortunately, he was doing a book signing, and I did not manage to get this one signed, but I did manage to get a copy. I have not read it. I really would have loved to have a signed copy, though. But, you know, the tricky thing about Book Expo was sometimes you're working, sometimes you're not. And when you're working, you really can't do fun things like that. Next, we have The Boy on the Porch by Shannon Creech, which I actually also managed to snag at that Book Expo. And I know I read it, but I have no memory of it at all, which is probably not good. And then there's Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech, which I did read and remember. I remember really loving it. This was a great book, and that's why I wanted to read other books by Sharon Creech. So it's a pity I don't remember the other one, but yeah, I loved that one. Then we have Dominicana by Angie Cruz. I've heard very mixed things about this one, but I have not gotten around to reading it yet. Controversial American Dirt by Janine Cummins. I have kind of deprioritized this book because of all of this, the Sturm und Drang around it. I may get around to reading it already, but I think I'm going to not TBR it anymore. I will keep Dominicana on my TBR, and we'll see if and when I get around to this. Moving along, we have The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which I read and think I need to reread. I remember not liking it and thinking that you probably would benefit from having read Virginia Woolf's book. Mrs. Dalloway, I don't know. So I think I'm going to reread it for the Pulitzer Prize project. I like this hardcover version of it that I have. I don't know if I'm going to read Mrs. Dalloway as a companion to it for that. I probably will, because I like to be a completist, and we'll see how that goes. Then there's The Lucky Ones by Rachel Cusk. This is an advanced copy I managed to get at some point along the way, have not read it. And then there's Matilda by Roald Dahl, which was my favorite book as a child, and still one of my favorite books to this day. I love it very much. And House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. Have not read this, but a lot of people have told me it's a great book, and I should get around to it. So we'll see when that happens. My local used bookstore happened to have a copy of Breath, Eyes, Memory last year, so I grabbed a copy of it. This is by Edwidge Danticat. I have never read any of her books, so I really need to get around to reading one of her books at some point. There are so many of her books that I would like to read. This just happens to be the one that I own. Then we have The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Dare. Really looking forward to reading this one. Have not gotten to it yet. Just came out this year. Now we have The Collected Stories of Lydia Davis. I'm really looking forward to getting to this at some point. I have kind of jumped around and read a few of them, but not nearly enough, and she is considered one of the great short story writers, so I feel like I need to get around. I need to prioritize this and get to it at some point. I keep getting put off by the size, but a lot of the stories are actually really short, so gotta do it. Now we have 2 books by Junot Diaz. I used to have a copy of Drown, and I don't know what happened to it, but here's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and This Is How You Lose Her. Both books that I loved when I read them. I feel like I need to revisit them and explore some of my complicated feelings about Junot Diaz in light of recent revelations about him and where I stand on that. I also have the illustrated edition of This Is How You Lose Her. However, it's on a it's at the bottom of a pile of books on the bookshelf that I'm staring at right now, and I'm not going to get it out, so you're just going to have to trust me that I have that as well. Now we have The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate DiCamillo. I love this book so much. It's really good. I used to have a copy of The Tale of Despero, and I guess I don't anymore, so I need to get on that as well, because I really love that book as well. And then there is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. I used to be really interested in reading this. I probably should revisit that idea, since there's a TV adaptation of this now. However, I was assigned to read Valis, I think it is, by Philip K. Dick in college, and I hated that book so much that I have really put this one off. I have read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and I remember thinking it was okay. I read it for a science fiction class in high school. So this was the one I wanted to do next. I ended up doing Valis, and I hated it so much that I don't know if I'll ever get around to this. I probably will at some point, I hope. Then we have 2 books by Dickens, Bleak House, which is something that's been on my TBR for a really long time. When I did my TBR tag, one of the questions was, what's been on your TBR the longest? And I said Emma and Bleak House, so it's got to get around to it. And then there's Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which I have read and I really enjoyed. I was kind of surprised that I did. We were assigned to read A Tale of Two Cities in high school, and I know I read it. I remember not liking it, but I think that's more because I was a resentful, angry, spiteful teenager than anything else. And we read A Christmas Carol when I was in junior high, and I remember liking that. But I really loved Great Expectations, and I've always meant to go back and read more Dickens, which I haven't done yet, but will. Next is Blue Nights by Joan Didion. This is an autographed copy. I was working holiday season at Barnes & Noble in Union Square in New York City, and she came to do a signing when this was released. So, of course, I snagged a copy of this. I have read it. It's a follow-up to The Year of Magical Thinking, which is an amazing, amazing, amazing book. If you have not read it, please do. It's so good. Joan Didion is amazing anyway. Then we have Andrew's Brain by E.L. Doctorow. I got this at Book Expo one of the years that I was there. Have not gotten around to reading it. And then there's The March by E.L. Doctorow, which I have also not gotten around to reading, but have always been curious. I will probably read this as a supplement to my Pulitzer Prize project, because it was a finalist the year that March by Geraldine Brooks, very confusing that the titles are so similar, did win the Pulitzer Prize. And then I have Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. I picked this up from a used bookstore in town because I haven't read it and really need to get around to it. So 3 books by E.L. Doctorow. Haven't read any. Got to do better about that. That finishes shelf number 4. So now we are moving to shelf number 5, which will finish off bookshelf number 1 in total. Don't know if that confused you or not, but it is what it is. First one from shelf number 5 is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I have read this. It is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I remember really liking it, even though it seems like a book I should not like, because I really don't like very flowery, description and prose, and this has a lot of that. But I really liked it. It also has a very contrived kind of melodramatic story. Somehow it managed to lure me in and get me very emotionally invested in it, and I really enjoyed it. Next is a poetry collection, My Alexandria by Mark Doty. This was recommended by several people when I was looking for poetry collections that I could read this year for my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge, so I am looking forward to getting to it at some point. Then we have Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I picked up a copy of this at a used bookstore last year, and because I've seen the movie, I love the movie, absolutely adore the movie, but I have not read the book and had not really considered reading the book until I've seen a lot of people on BookTube talking about it, and that really got me intrigued. So I would like to read this at some point, hopefully soon. Then there's Selected Stories by Andre Dubus. This is another book that was recommended by that GM from Borders. I have not gotten around to reading it. I have not read a single story from it, but I would like to at some point, as you can tell from a lot of these books. Then we have a book from his son, Andre Dubus III, Dirty Love. I managed to snag this at Book Expo and have not gotten around to reading it. And then there's another book by Andre Dubus III, The Garden of Last Days. I have read this one. It's a messy book, a sprawling book. I remember liking it though. I feel like it's very ambitious. It tries to do a lot. Some of it misses, but I think it hits more than it misses, if that makes sense. Then we have Attic by Catherine Dunn. This is something I picked up because I had never read anything by her other than Geek Love, which is the next book that we'll talk about. And I really wanted to try something else because I loved Geek Love when I read it. Some part of me feels like I should reread this book because it might be problematic, and I wouldn't have realized that at the time I read it. Just one of those interesting things. Then there is Elemento P by Mark Dunn. Very charming book. If you have not read it, I would absolutely recommend it. Obviously, I have read it. Then there's Blackbird by Larry Duplachen. This was on my TBR for June and I did not get to it, so I'm hoping to get to it soon. Let me say get to it one more time. Then we have Wit, a play by Margaret Edson. I saw this performed before I read the play, and God, this is a devastating play, but it is so good. So good. It's one of my favorites. I would recommend it. Then there's Half-Blood Blues by Essie Adujan. I love this book. I was not a fan of Washington Black, but I really love this one, so I would recommend this to you very much so. My elevator pitch for it is that it is Amadeus crossed with Cabaret. I mean, come on. Now we get into 3 books by Jennifer Egan. The first one is Look at Me, which I have not read, but I picked up because it was recommended to me by someone at Borders many years ago, before she ever became a Pulitzer Prize winner, and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. Then we have Manhattan Beach, which is her most recent book, and I have not gotten around to reading it, even though I snapped it up the second it came out. And then the one she did win the Pulitzer Prize for, which is A Visit from the Goon Squad, and I read this one. I enjoyed it. I also saw her speak at the 92nd Street Y with Jeffrey Eugenides, whose books will be coming up, and love her. She's very smart. Moving right along, we have Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I have not read this book. I'm kind of ashamed that I have never read this book, and I really need to get around to doing it. Then there's Ducks Newburyport, which so many people on BookTube have gotten around to, and I have not. And I will. I promise. And then there's My Dark Places by James Ellroy. I read LA Confidential, preferred the movie to the book, actually. Knocked that one down. That I think is an instance where the movie is better than the book. This one really jumped out to me as another book of his because it's about his mother's murder and his reaction to it and how that drove him to crime fiction, and that always sounded really interesting to me, so I need to get around to this. Continuing through the E's, we have Things We Lost in the Fire, Stories by Mariana Enriquez. This is an advanced copy, and I have never gotten around to reading it, which I really should do because it's only small, and I like short stories, so I should do that. Then we have 3 books by Louise Erdrich. The first is Love Medicine, which I have not read, but I went to her store, Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis, and they have, of course, they have a lot of signed copies of all of her books, and I picked this one up as a souvenir while I was there because I really want to read it. I need to get around to it. Plague of Doves, which I absolutely adore and encourage you to read if you have not. Then there's The Roundhouse, which I think is good, but not great. But good. Finishing off shelf number 5, bookshelf number 1, we have a bunch of books by Jeffrey Eugenides. The first is Fresh Complaint, which is his newest book, and it is a collection of short stories. I have not gotten around to reading it yet. The Marriage Plot, which was his book before Fresh Complaint, which I did not like. at all, actually. Middlesex, which I loved, absolutely loved when I read it, and feel like I need to revisit because in the years since it was published, our understanding of intersex has changed a lot. So I'm a little worried that parts of it might be problematic, but maybe well-intentioned. I don't know. So I feel like I need to go back and revisit this, and it is a Pulitzer Prize winner, so I may revisit it intentionally as part of that project. And of course, his first novel, The Virgin Suicides. This is a European edition. The other one that I had was a movie tie-in. I kept it if I ever want to reread this, and I do actually read the first chapter of this book a lot. It has one of my favorite openings of a book ever. Like ever. So if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to check that out. I also have a signed first edition of it. Hang on, let me show you that really quickly because it's right here. Boom. Boom. When I mentioned that he spoke at the 92nd Street Y with Jennifer Egan, so I had ordered a first edition of this because I loved it, so I made sure I brought it, and he signed it, and look at him without a beard on the back. Isn't that cute? And that completes bookshelf number 1, all 5 shelves. Now, just because this is something that interests me, I wanted to see how many of the books on my bookshelf I have read. So I went through just now and I counted the books that I have read and how many books are on each shelf. The total came out to be that of bookshelf number 1, I read 60 books out of a total of 143. I'm not going to do what percentage that is right now because I'm recording on my phone, and then that's literally the only way I would be able to figure out a percentage. But doesn't seem like a good percentage. So I have a lot of work to do, but part of what I like to do with my shelves is, yes, I like to have books that I have read and that have a conversation about what I've read, but I also really like to have books that I am going to get to. It's kind of aspirational, so it's not really a surprise that I have not read most of the books in this one, at least, and I'm willing to bet that that's going to continue to be a trend throughout the rest of them, but we'll see how that goes. And if you're interested in the books that I went through and kind of did a quick reevaluation of my TBR, the ones that are on my TBR actively are The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis, Song of the Loon by Richard Amory, Emma by Jane Austen, The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree by Shikufa Azar, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, also by James Baldwin, Regeneration by Pat Barker, You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr, The Sellout by Paul Beatty, Wish Her Safe at Home by Stephen Benatar, The Vanishing Half, Down and Dirty Pictures, The Good Earth, His Bloody Project, Death Comes for the Archbishop, The Water Dancer, Dominicana, Breath Eyes Memory, The Girl with the Louding Voice, Collected Stories of Lydia Davis, Bleak House, Ragtime, My Alexandria, which is the poetry collection, Rebecca, Blackbird, Invisible Man, Ducks Newburyport, and Love Medicine. So those are the ones that are actively on my TBR from there. There are a lot more that I would like to read in there, but that's my active TBR, so for whatever that's worth. So that concludes Bookshelf Tour Part 1. If you have thoughts about any of these, I would love to hear them. If you have recommendations of things that I should prioritize before other ones, please let me know. I would love to hear it because obviously I have a lot that I need to figure out in terms of priorities in these books. And thank you, especially if you've made it this far. I appreciate your time. Thank you for that. And I will be back. I don't know when I will be doing Part 2 for this because, like I said, with quarantine and work and everything going on, it can be a little difficult to find the time to do a longer form video, especially one that's going to be kind of involved. So I don't know. I'll try to do it soon, but we'll see. But I will be back in the meantime. And until next time, happy reading.